What is up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we are back on the Trans Am project, and if you didn't catch my last video, I talked about my wife bought me a cam for Christmas, and the normal method of putting a cam in can be done with the engine in the car, but I have several oil leaks, a rear main seal, the pan gasket, so I'm going to replace all of that. So in order to do that, I'm pulling the engine out. So in the last video, which if you didn't catch, I'll link up here above, but we took the drive shaft out, and we took all the exhaust off, and a couple things up front. We took the alternator out, the starter out. So today we're going to tackle the transmission, and unfortunately I do not have a transmission jack, so I'm going to just lower the lift down and use my jack just like I did when I did the torque converter on the ground. So today though, like I said, we're going to be taking the transmission out, and we're going to start with the torque converter bolts up here, and then we'll drop the transmission down and try to get everything out of the way. So before we can take out the torque converter bolts, we need to take this 10mm out that holds this little plastic plate in, just kind of a block off plate. Now, once you get that shield out of the way, there are 3 torque converter bolts, and it really depends on what torque converter you have, but you need to get a 24mm on the crank, and you need to roll it around until you can see one of the 17mm. Go ahead and take it out. You're going to spin it, take the next one out, and so on and so forth until you get all 3 of them out. Now, I talked about this in the last video, but hopefully you guys are taking the time to get some plastic bags and labeling all the bolts you're pulling apart. It just makes the process so much easier when you're going back together. Now, once you get the torque converter bolts out, the next step is I'm going to take the 18mm out of the transmission mount. There's just a nut here in the center, and then we will get the 2 outer of the actual bracket itself. So as you can see, once you take that out, the transmission falls. And the reason we have to do that is to gain access to those top bolt holes to get the bolts out. But your transmission is going to leak just because it is going downhill now. So the tail shaft's going to be leaking some fluid. I've just got some towels under there catching it right now. But once this gets down, we can go ahead and take our torque arm bolts out that we talked about in the last video. Obviously you can't get to those when the transmission's up as far as it is. So now we're going to unhook some of the electronics and the transmission lines and then the shifter, and then we'll start on the bolts that actually bolt the transmission to the block. Now the next 2 things we're going to do is we're going to pop this off, which is just a ball and socket. Generally just use a screwdriver to pop it off, and then we're going to take the 2 13mm out to get the actual shifter linkage loose. Now the last thing we need to do before we're able to actually take the bolts out is we need to loosen up or take loose the bolt or the clips that hold the transmission cooler lines in place. So all these are is you're going to need a pick. There's it's almost like pulling off a window crank. So you're going to pull this little clip out, and then your 2 lines will just pop out. So once we get those lines out of place, it's time to go ahead and tackle the bolts that bolt it to the block. Now there's one at the 12 o'clock position, one about the 11 o'clock position. There's a dummy hole on the 1 o'clock position, but there's 8 total, and we're going to take 4 of them out, and we're going to leave the bottom 4 that I can access from the bottom till last. And normally we would take all of them out, but since we don't have a transmission jack, it makes it a little harder because we can't just let the transmission fall. So I'm going to take those top 4 out, and you're going to need a swivel and a pretty long extension to reach all the way up there to the top. But after we do that, then we'll let the car down, and I'll put a jack, just a floor jack under it, and we'll take those bottom 4 out, and then the transmission will be loose. once I got those bolts off on the top, I went ahead and let my lift down. And honestly, even though I don't have a transmission jack, this is gonna be, it's gonna be okay. I've got my floor jack here with a block of wood supporting the transmission. I'm gonna go ahead and take those 4 bolts off, the 2 on this side and the 2 on the other side. And then I'll probably have somebody help me run the jack while I back the transmission off. Should be able to get it off, but just letting it down may be an issue. I may have somebody help me do that. Well, now all the transmission bolts are out, and as you can see, it's still in place. You're gonna have to wiggle it off the dowel pins on the back of the block. So like I said, it does help if you've got somebody running the other end of the jack. I'm just gonna wiggle it back and forth, and then I'm gonna have somebody help me set it down. Well guys, as you can see, the transmission's out. Not the best method really to pull it out. It spilled a ton of fluid, as you can see. I got a big mess to clean up, but nonetheless, it is out. And well, I need a transmission jack. I think I'll probably buy one before I put this back together. So I've got a couple of things that I wanna do while we've got the thing up in the air. So we'll move on to those. I'm gonna put this transmission on probably a piece of cardboard so I can slide it around, just to at least get it out of the way. Now that the transmission's out of the way and that ginormous mess I made's cleared up, I'm gonna go ahead and take the flywheel off. So just 15 millimeter. Now, if you don't have an impact, the best way to do this is you're gonna have to lock the flywheel somehow. You can get a flywheel locking tool, which I explained in another video. But let's whip this off, and we're gonna probably unplug some of the electrical connections as well. Once I got the flywheel off, it doesn't look like the rear main's leaking at all. I'm probably gonna go ahead and put one in it while I've got it apart, but it looks to be a majority of our issue is the pan gasket, which we're gonna replace. That's part of the reason we're pulling this motor apart. But I'm gonna go ahead and start to take like the ground loose on the back side of the head here, any of the connections that I can reach on the bottom side, as well as your crank position sensor, the ground here on the side of the block, and your oil level sensor. I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect all those now. Before I set it down again, I'm gonna go ahead and take this 10 millimeter bolt out here for a ground. That was keeping me from getting this harness that goes down to the alternator and the oxygen sensor out in the last video. So I'm gonna go ahead and take this loose, and then we're gonna set it down and might take a few things off on the top side. Now with it down on the ground and that ground strap undone, we can pull this harness up, kind of get it out of the way. And I'm gonna go ahead and take loose where the harness threads in here on top of the fuel rail. I'm gonna pop those all loose and try to move the harness over and out of the way. So the next two things we're going to unhook is the brake booster here. This line goes to the back side of the intake. And inevitably, every time I do this, so every time I take an intake off, I snap off the oil pressure sensor in the back. They're just really brittle from the factory, and a lot of times you hook it on the way out. So unhook that. Now we're going to unhook the fuel lines, which you're going to need a piece to connect. A fuel line disconnect piece, just a piece of plastic. If you don't have one of those, you can get one at your local parts store. But we'll get the fuel lines out of the way, and then we should be almost ready to take the intake off. So once the fuel lines are disconnected, we're ready to take the intake off. And there's kind of a trick to doing it because you don't have enough room to get, there's 10 8mm bolts, that 5 on each side that bolts the intake down. But in the back, you're unable to get the bolt out because you don't have enough room due to the cowl laying over it. So a lot of times that's why people drop the engine out of the bottom. It gives you just more room to work with. But all you have to do is on these back 4 bolts, you pull them up and wrap a little bit of tape around them, and then we're able to get it out. But I'll show you that process. We're gonna go ahead and loosen up these 8mm, all 10 of these 8mm. So at this point, the intake's loose. So we are going to go ahead and put some tape on those back bolts. Like I said, you don't have enough room to pull them out, and they want to stay in place. So put a little bit of tape, you pull up the bolt, and I'll show you here in just a second, but just wrap a little tape around them. So you guys can see what I'm talking about. I wrap tape around those bolts just to keep them up. Like I said, you can't pull them out. So we're ready to pull the intake out, and just go slow. You may have a couple connections on the back side to the map sensor. I tried to get all those loose. I'm pretty sure I got them all, but if you don't, just take your time. Well, the intake is off, and this is honestly one of the first times I've been able to take it off without breaking this off. Chances are it'll probably break some other time for some reason. But anyway, guys, we're gonna go ahead and move the harness out of the way. It's all loose on this side, with the exception of there's one 15mm bolt on the back side here, grounded to the back side of the head, and it's really not even a ground, it's just keeping it in place. So we're gonna loosen that up, and then we can fold the harness over to the passenger side. Okay guys, so we are finished up yet again on this car. I got a lot accomplished today, or at least I feel like I got a lot accomplished today, but I've got a ton of cleanup now. And well, we got the transmission out, we got the intake off, we got a lot of the wiring out of the way. So on the next video, we're going to tackle all the front accessories. I just didn't want to make a bigger mess than I already have today. So we're gonna take all the front accessories off, we're gonna take the radiator out, the condenser out, and hopefully we'll pull the motor on the next episode. So guys, if you like this video, if you like this content, please smash that thumbs up button. If you're not subscribed, go down and hit the subscribe button. Hit the little bell icon, that way you're notified every time we drop a new video. And well, stay tuned to see what we get into with this car next.